Hi, this is Chuck Wolf, and welcome back to Place Parts. Here in Newbury, at a park that's built essentially over a former riverbed, we re-examine the question of the merger of nature and the built environment in redevelopment settings. And just a couple of miles to the north, we can frame the questions perhaps even more concisely. With the wind blowing and the clouds above, the question remains, how similar is this landscape to what has been here for hundreds of years? What do the landforms tell us about human habitation? And for any changes going forward, what from this landscape should remain? For those of you who followed this series, at least I'm noticing that it's picked up a lot on messages from a certain section of the book that speaks to how cities such as Paris, San Francisco, and even Chengdu, China, are re-examining the relationship between green spaces and hardscape, often involving a forensic exercise that rediscovers a landscape that perhaps we can no longer see. We're going to continue with that inquiry in this episode. The dialogue, to borrow a phrase, on friction between the latent natural environment and the environment that we see today. Over the years, there's been a great American landscape architect who I've admired very much, but really not met, even though we're both Seattle people. Shannon Nichol is here today in Seattle at, what time is it? 10 in the morning?
10:12.
10:12, yes, and it's 5:12 p.m. here. Anyway, Shannon is a principal of the Gustafs and Guthrie Nichol firm in Seattle. Has done really world-class work around the United States, in Boston and Chicago and San Francisco, and the Gardens for the Gates Foundation in Seattle, and really amazing stuff. And we've connected in recent times and started talking a lot about the issues of context, but from the perspective of the natural environment. I wax poetic about that as a presumed author and former lawyer. You do this for a living, Shannon. And so maybe we could spend a few minutes talking about the natural environment, water, flora, fauna, and how it fits in to a comprehensive way of looking at a place of the sort that I've parlayed in the book. So what say you about all of this?
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that the interesting thing now, and you mentioned this in many different ways in your book, is that that's become more of a choice for us. It's become something that we have to force ourselves to be constrained by. And in many ways, that's my role on projects, is bringing in what my colleague David Malda calls the friction of place and natural history, natural context, so that the built things that we could just be mass producing with little heed or obstacles presented to us by the natural place, that they are shaped and constrained and conformed by things like landform, by ecology, by water movement, and things like that, even in the middle of a dense city. So our job is often to help people see as a real thing. It's a real physical thing that's there that we should be responding to, and even let ourselves be constrained by. The topography and the way the land was shaped by natural forces, and the bioregion.
Yeah, then we were talking about that word before I first learned that term when I was practicing law in Connecticut in the 90s, because there was a very active movement around understanding the state based on watersheds. You know, these things have been with us for a while, which is another part of the story, isn't it? But I think, if I'm not mistaken, you like to also riff on with clients and around the office what you can't see about a site, right?
Yeah. This is almost the opposite, or, you know, it's not the enemy of, but it's almost the opposite of urban sketching, which is a popular way for landscape architects to work. They walk around and they have sometimes have social groups sketching what they see on the street and observing what's there today.
Mm-hmm.
Our job, we've found to be most successful in deeply integrating the natural environment into the built environment, is to draw what we can't see. And what that means is do drawings, often they're silly cartoons, of the landform that is underneath the buildings. So reminding people that a freeway is a land surface, it is a landscape. It's been cut and filled and carved out from a place, but it's still ground. And so sometimes, depending on what our site is, we may just draw the shape of the ground today, take things that are distracting away from it. We exaggerate things. We can exaggerate things in hand drawings in ways that you can't credibly do if you're using, you know, GIS software or something. And you know, help people, they'll recognize it when they see it. Often it's like a familiar face that's been there, but you just haven't been noticing it when we abstract things like that artistically.
And so does that become an enhanced site feature in a completed project then, that you would bring out this element of the landscape that might already be present, but is much more present as a
sometimes
statement?
Yeah, sometimes it becomes a feature. Sometimes it's just something we're responding to. Sometimes it's something we're fixing. So we might show something might feel like a dead end, like a place might feel like a dead end in the city, or it may feel isolated. And sometimes if we draw the place as a landscape today, and then we draw what it was before X or Y happened, often from 1950 onward,
right,
we'll see, oh, there's a gap. We can restore this gap by putting this slope back on our site, or pulling the water through from this edge to this edge again.
Yeah, so this is why I am so fixated on, before going forward, really immersing through, in my books, I've always come up with nerdy acronyms to drive
I like this one.
You know what they're doing, like, you know, look, engage, assess, review, and negotiate. So keep people on task, right? But it sounds like you're saying it's perfectly reasonable from your professional perspective, if it's agreeable to the client, of course, to go through this exercise to spur further thinking, but not necessarily include it in the final project. This isn't a situation where you have to have a Starchitect landscape feature that is this emblem, right?
Absolutely. That's something we work so hard to, I think, bring people on board with an approach that we don't need to bring in a novel foreign object or design or something we purport, you know, to be this invention in white space into our sites. If we, your first L and learn, if we look, we will find so much to work with. What are the existing qualities of this landscape, and what's there now? What did it used to be? How did it get to be the way it is today? And that becomes a story that is colorful and interesting and complicated and weird. And you hardly need to add more to that to come up with something compelling to try to interpret into a design. A lot of times it's just putting stuff back, or it's been wiped so clean in the rush of grading and recent decades of modern efficient development that you don't see it because the cues have probably been wiped away, but we can usually put those back.
Right.
Have a pretty interesting design. It forces us to do some pretty weird things in our landscape designs.
Yeah, but it's, to me anyway, it's common sense to really, sort of understand what you're working with and what you're receiving, as
yes,
sort of said before. You may recall in the book, there's some pages that start in Paris with contributor artist Cadine Navarro, who receives a place in an artist sense in a very similar way to what you're describing. And then I moved to some other places. I reference essentially bioregions in Chengdu, China. I talk about San Francisco and London and the sort of forensic rediscovery of ecological features, often lost rivers, but sometimes other things. Do you have a project example that you could talk about of putting your method to work?
That's what I dream about doing on every project, is finding that ghost creek or the ghost shoreline or feature.
Or the ghost, just the
or
ghost.
the ghost, just any ghost.
Yeah.
The Lurie Garden in Chicago is divided into two. It's on a rooftop of a parking garage. It's on the 5th floor of a parking garage. So, when you look at we were on top of a parking deck, which was not necessarily full of history and texture. And looking at the history of the site and why things feel the way they do there and the way it's been developed and its incredible stark flatness of Grant Park, we realized that right under our feet on top of that parking garage, looking down, there was a retaining wall and an angled rail line that followed that angle of that retaining wall below the parking garage. And below that angled retaining wall had been a shoreline at one point that had been filled out into the shallow lake shore with the rubble from the Great Fire of the late 1800s in Chicago. And finding that, and that sort of, that you're standing there and you're aware that you're kind of contacting the ground of Chicago with one foot, and the lake and the mushy mouth of the Chicago River, which before the channel had been reversed, that had been a great marsh there, that you could stand in this one place and you can feel the upland and you can feel the lake to this day, standing on top of a parking garage, simply because the land and the water are still there, and there's still a slight topography to downtown Chicago in the presence of the river. Anyhow, that was really exciting, and that drove something that wasn't a literal replication of that, but we have these two gardens divided by this diagonal slash. When you're on the city side garden or the upland garden, you're on a bit of a hill. And so you feel this kind of prospect and you're drawn. We made the landform kind of drop away from you toward the lake so that your body naturally turns and you feel like you have land at your back and openness in front of you. And then the lakeside garden or plate, which we called the dark plate, because wet plate didn't sound very appetizing. That one has more of a primitive, marshy, you are immersed in plants. The paths that move there through that garden are kind of sunken into the ground. So you feel like your body's kind of going through mud in a really abstract way. Anyway, not literal, but it gave us all the ideas we needed, probably more than we needed to drive our design of a garden.
Personally, obviously, I don't think it's too much to do literally that level of deep dive to understand where you're working. Now, a lot of people don't have patience with that.
Sure.
And
I've encountered them.
I'm sure you have, because I certainly did. I think we're all struggling with these words that people think they know what they are: authentic, character.
Those are dangerous words.
Yeah, they're very dangerous words, you know, and until you really immerse in whatever way, the answer is kind of the lawyerly, it depends, you know, it really depends on the circumstances. So that's it. No, that's a very cool story, and I appreciate that. So have you found at GGN over the last year that the types of things that you're interested in, you've described, are of more interest from a client perspective, or is it sort of a same old?
I'm lucky, GGN is lucky at this point, that our clients tend to come to us because they want that kind of deep dive. They want their project and frankly themselves to be an empathetic, integrated neighbor and member of the community. So they come to us because we can help them find those connections and be their empathetic, absorptive eyes and ears, and then tell that story and offer it to people through the landscape. What I've been seeing over the last, if we go to a year timeframe, and really spurred by the conversations that were spurred by the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw clients respond by saying, we need to do a better job of listening. We need, what stories are we overlooking in our communities that we could be designing toward? I think that has caused a really interesting intersectional opening and benefit of looking for those quieter stories, looking for people in the community to connect with and design with as partners who have been historically underserved or underrepresented. And that's great for a landscape, because what that does for us, and what you are looking at in sections in your book where you talk about scale and things like that, we end up having we have more support from the client to gather more influence that informs a finer, local, slower scale. If we're engaging more with the community, we are going to be serving these local daily patterns more in the landscape, and we're going to get a finer grained design.
Yeah, and I'm nodding eagerly because I understand. I obviously have the perspective that even without the pandemic, that was increasingly important, and the notion of the deep listening and the notion of co-creation and community led and all of that. I mean, we can give lip service to it, but my sense is that one thing that has happened is creating an even greater opportunity for that approach. I seem to, it's not a scientifically validated impression, but
I'll take it.
In listening to a variety of Zoom conferences and meetings and so on, I certainly get that sense. Well, Shannon, it's been great. I think this is,
Likewise.
And I really appreciate you're one of the few people who's actually read the book so far, and so it's great. And
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And
continue to use it as well.
Oh, thank you. And I think we'll see you again within a month or two, because we're going to have another session out of Stockholm where we're going to talk about book themes even more, and you've kindly agreed to be part of that. So this isn't, thank you. So this isn't the end. So thanks again, and we will be in touch.